So hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. Our webinar tonight is called Is Anti-Zionism Antisemitism? A debate with Batya Ungar-Sargon and Mark Dubowitz. My name is Agnes Imani. I'm the founder of United Grassroots Movement. During an unprecedented rise in anti-Semitism worldwide and a massive surge in Canada, combined with mainstream organizations failing to take significant action, United Grassroots Movement was created to proactively confront Jew hatred. United Grassroots Movement is an independent, not-for-profit organization formed of a coalition of grassroots activists across the professional, political, and religious spectrum, united in a common goal to educate others about anti-Semitism, Israel, and the Jewish people. We proactively battle anti-Semitism, build interfaith bridges, and inspire more understanding about Israel using many approaches such as political activism, legal matters, Israel, rights education, social media, interfaith outreach, rallies, events, webinars, and much, much more. United Grassroots Movement partnered in the Israel rally last year in Toronto's Mel Lastman Square, and also had a lead role in organizing the Israel Solidarity car rally along Bathurst Street, attracting thousands of participants. And many of you might already know our No Hate Against Jews bus shelter campaign that appeared in 180 bus shelters across the GTA. To learn more about us or to support our work, please visit unitedgrassroots.com. Now, I'd like to introduce Dave Gordon, journalist and one of our incredible volunteer directors. Take it away, Dave.
Thank you very much, Agnes. I want to begin by thanking Kinneret Dubowitz for initiating this event tonight, and also mark that today, the topic of our webinar takes on a special poignancy, as tomorrow is International Holocaust Remembrance Day. With anti-Semitism at a fever pitch in the Western world, especially lately, it is now more important than ever to commemorate the Shoah and to impart its lessons. We know the slippery slope of what happens when a person or a group is othered with enough frequency, facing the indifference of bystanders, and what can occur over a short period of time. In fact, it was this week, 80 years ago, almost to the day, that the infamous Wannsee Conference took place in Germany. Whereas the Shoah was in full swing, the conference was the coordinated plan to mechanize it, to make it efficient, to improve the scope and military precision of the genocide against Jews. There was also the plan to instill, encourage, and stoke anti-Semitism in towns and cities, so as to more easily justify the ill treatment of Jews. Even Nazis knew what today some refuse to recognize is the stripping of dignity and hatred of a group of people that gives license and permission for others to act on evil, not merely to make hatred tolerable or acceptable, but a virtue. To paraphrase Professor and author Gil Troy, demonization and fear-mongering are the crack cocaine of anti-Semitism. And that is why today it's important to know what does or does not constitute anti-Semitism and how those lines are blurred across. Identifying Jew hatred is the first step to combating it. The answers might not necessarily be as straightforward and self-evident. They could be layered, nuanced, or complicated, and still in other circumstances, black and white. Our speakers today may very well give us insight to these and other pressing issues. Batya Ungar-Sargon is a former opinion editor at Forward and recently the deputy opinion editor at Newsweek. Her recent book is Bad News: How Woke Media is Undermining Democracy. Among many ideas, it reveals how American journalism shifted from the working class towards the wokeness and affluent. She's written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Foreign Policy, and other publications. She's appeared numerous times on MSNBC, NBC, NPR, and many other media outlets. She also holds a PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Our other panelist is Mark Dubowitz, the Chief Executive of Foundation for Defense of Democracies, the Washington, D.C. based nonpartisan policy institute. Mark's an expert on Iran's nuclear program and global threat network, and is widely recognized as one of the key influencers in shaping policies to counter the threats from the regime in Iran. In fact, in 2019, Iran sanctioned Mark and his organization, calling them, quote, the designing and executing arm of the US administration on Iran policy. He has advised the Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations and lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and testified more than 20 times before the United States Congress and foreign legislatures. He is the author or co-author of dozens of studies on economic sanctions and Iran's nuclear program, and is widely published and cited in US and international media. Mark has a master's degree in international public policy from Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies, where he focused on China. Ladies and gentlemen, how seldom are we privileged to hear the brave few who speak with such wisdom, conviction, and fearlessness as Batya Ungar-Sargon and Mark Dubowitz. And we're honored to have them today to discuss the topic, is anti-Zionism, anti-Semitism. There will be a brief Q&A after the talk, so please type your questions in the chat box. Take it away, Mark and Batya.
Great. Well, Dave, Agnes, thank you so much. Batya, it's such a great pleasure to be on this with you. You know, you might wonder why a guy who focuses on Iran and China and sanctions is debating the topic of Zionism and anti-Semitism. It's because Kinneret Dubowitz, who helped organize this, is my sister, and she figured I was an easy guest to get. Because Batya is a very difficult guest to get because she's in incredible demand. And before we start, I want to do a book promo because Batya is not a good promoter of her own book. This is the best book I read in 2021. I read it cover to cover one Shabbat. It is brilliant. It's insightful. And as wonderful a writer as Batya is, she's an incredible speaker and debater. So, you know, with that in mind, this is going to be a tough debate. And so I'm prepared to lose, but I'm going to lose in style to one of the best people out there. So Batya, thank you. Thanks for appearing. And I'm really looking forward to our conversation. All right, well, let's kick it off. All right, Batya. So tomorrow, as Dave said, International Holocaust Remembrance Day. So probably a good thing to start with in framing this debate is the working definition of anti-Semitism that was put out by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is an intergovernmental organization, put out a definition a number of years ago. It's been adopted to the credit of IHRA by dozens of countries around the world, and including the European Commission and Council and Parliament and the UN Secretary General. And it's become kind of the de facto or definitive standard for what anti-Semitism is and is not. So I just want to quote a few lines from that. It's actually quite lengthy. It's really worth everybody reading it to get a real sense of what goes into this definition. And a lot of work was put into this by experts on anti-Semitism from around the world. So the first thing it says is that manifestations might include the targeting of the state of Israel conceived as a Jewish collectivity, right? What it doesn't include, and I think this is really important, and I think Batya and I wholeheartedly agree on this, it doesn't include criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country that cannot be regarded as anti-Semitism, right? Israel, we have the right to criticize Israel. Batya and I both criticize Israel. Batya and I are both Zionists and Jews, and certainly not anti-Semitic. So criticizing Israel's policies in a way that is proportionate to its mistakes, and certainly similar to that leveled against any other country, cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic, right? We're also both Americans. Batya and I are very critical of the United States. We're certainly not anti-American, and we both love the United States and think that goes without saying. Okay, what else? It says, accusing the Jews as a people or Israel as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Holocaust. Anti-Semitism. I think Batya and I would both agree on that, and that's very poignant given what tomorrow is commemorating. Certainly, there are a lot of anti-Zionists who are guilty of that, of denying or exaggerating the Holocaust. And as somebody who's followed the Iranian regime for many years, I can tell you the Iranian regime that denies the Holocaust and was the only country to vote against the resolution that passed unanimously at the UN is clearly both anti-Zionist and anti-Semitic. accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel. Wow. Well, that's something that I think Batya and I probably have to deal with in the United States a lot. This whole dual loyalties charge. You Canadians, you don't really have this in Canada because there's a lot of acceptance for hyphenated Canadians. In the United States, wow, if you're an American Jew and you're pro-Israel, you're going to get that dual loyalty charge all the time. A lot of anti-Zionists throw that charge out repeatedly. They're anti-Semites. Denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel, for example, is a racist endeavor. Now, that's clearly denying the right for the Jewish people to a sovereign state. And for example, claiming that it's a racist endeavor. A lot of anti-Zionists both deny Israel and Israelis their sovereign right, and Jews that sovereign right to a Jewish state, and certainly are always claiming repeatedly that the Jewish state is a racist endeavor. We talked about applying double standards, not expected of any other democratic nation. And of course, drawing comparisons of Israeli policy to that on the Nazis, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the state of Israel. These are all hallmarks of the anti-Zionists, right? They constantly violate all of these standards, making many of them anti-Semites. But I'm not here to argue that some anti-Zionists are anti-Semites. I'm not even here to argue, Batya, that the majority of anti-Zionists are anti-Semite. No, the task before me, I know, the task before me is all anti-Zionists are anti-Semites, right? Which makes this an interesting debate. And, you know, I would argue quite a difficult debate for me to win, which is why I wore my Roots Canada shirt in order to appeal to the domestic Canadian audience and curry favor with them. All right. So let's get into the heart of the debate, and I'm going to then turn it over to Batya. You know, Batya, if you and I were alive in 1880 and we were having a debate on this topic, you know, I was a capitalist and you were a socialist, and you believed at the end of the day that the answer to the question of the Jewish people was to become a socialist or a communist, right? And give away your religion, give away your commitment to revitalizing the state of Israel, and become a communist and devote yourself to the workers. Well, that would be interesting, right? We could have a debate on that. And in fact, in 1880, having that debate on whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism would probably be fine, because there was no Jewish state in 1880. You know, in 1920, if you and I then 40 years later had the same debate, where I was a German Reform Jew in America, and you were a modern Orthodox Zionist Jew in America, and we were debating this, and I would say, you know, Batya, wow, I'm a Reformed German Jew. I'm in America. I'm proud to be American. I want to assimilate into American society. And you said, you know, Mark, that's really nice, but there are a lot of Jews who don't live in America, who live around the world, including in Europe, and their attempts at assimilation in Germany and in Austria and in other countries are destined to fail. And we had a whole debate about whether anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. I think I would lose the debate, because I think it's entirely possible, theoretically, before the existence of the state of Israel, to argue that anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitism. Now, by the way, 20 years later, you would be wrong, because the Holocaust would have demonstrated the failure of assimilation, particularly in Europe, as a solution to the Jewish question. Well, Batya, we're having this debate in 2022, right? Thank God. The state of Israel has been around since 1948. It has 10 million people, about 7 million Jews. It exists, right? So to deny the existence of the state of Israel and Jewish sovereignty in 2022 is very different than in 1880 or in 1920, or indeed any day before 1948. But once there is a Jewish state and there are 7 million Jewish citizens, and I'm going to ask you, what do we do with those citizens if we don't believe in the right for Israel to exist as a Jewish sovereign state? And that is why anybody who denies the existence of the Jewish state, in other words, anybody who is an anti-Zionist, is an anti-Semite. Because what you're suggesting, not you, of course, but those who are anti-Zionists are suggesting, is that the Jewish state should be abolished. It should go away. Now, some of them are quite flagrant about this. I mean, the supreme leader, Ali Khamenei of Iran, right, for him, Holocaust denial and the annihilation of the state of Israel needs to happen either militarily through nuclear weapons, or he occasionally gets cute and calls for a referendum. It's a referendum. At the end of the day, people will vote, and at some point, the millions of Palestinians will outnumber the millions of Jews, and they will vote out the state of Israel. But at the end of the day, we know the regime in Iran is annihilationist and genocidal, and that is clear anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. But Batya, you and I know lots of people who are not the supreme leader of Iran, who are actually Americans, including American Jews, who because of their criticism of the state of Israel over Palestinian issues, have step-by-step moved to a point in the political spectrum where they are today Jewish state abolitionists. They want to abolish the Jewish state. Now, those people are anti-Zionists because they don't believe in the Jewish state, and they are therefore anti-Semites. And so, according to the definition put forward by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the definition which says, do not apply double standards, do not deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination, and all the other parameters that I laid out, or criteria that I laid out, it is clear that in 2022, if you deny the existence of the state of Israel, if your belief is that 7 million Jews should just go away from their homeland and disappear, I don't know how they disappear, they'll fly out, or they'll get killed, or they'll just assimilate, then if you are advocating that position as an anti-Zionist, you are clearly an anti-Semite. I'll stop there.
Well, you've given me a lot to chew on. First of all, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Mark, for this opportunity. It's such a pleasure to be engaged in a debate with someone that I respect so much and disagree with so much on this topic. Thank you, Agnes and Dave and Kinneret, for setting this up. And thank you to the audience. I know that I'm sort of, in Mark's home territory, both from a geographic point of view, and also I assume that a lot of you agree with him on this topic. And I am super, super humbled to be able to share with you my position. My view on debates is that the point of a debate is not necessarily to convince people, but it's to give them a choice. And so that's going to be my very modest goal with this evening, is to suggest that there is another choice on this issue, even if ultimately you end up still agreeing with Mark. See, set expectations low is a very, very good way to enter this. Look, many anti-Zionists are anti-Semites. That is, I think we're completely in agreement about that. Many people who believe that there should be no Jewish state hate Jews. That is a fact that I'm not willing to even touch, because it's so obviously the case. It is so obviously the case. So let's just put that aside, right? The question is can there be a form of anti-Zionism that is not anti-Semitic, while acknowledging that there is something in the position that anti-Semites are drawn to? That's sort of the very modest thing that I'm going to try to eke out, which is that there can be a person who tells you that they don't believe that the state of Israel should exist, and they are not bigoted against Jews. That's the position that I want to, that position is possible intellectually. I think I know people like that. Also, I want to point out in my book, I have a section on anti-Zionism as part of the woke sickness that is taking over our institutions. I'm not a proponent of anti-Zionism. I think it's very stupid. I think it is of a piece with the other pieces of wokeness that are also very stupid and bad, morally compromised. I don't think that is not the position I have, because I don't think that is the moral position when it comes to the fate of the Jews. So I want to make that very clear as well. Like, I'm not defending the fact that anti-Zionism can exist in a non-anti-Semitic version because I think that it's moral, or that it's good, or that it's the position you should have in any way. So why am I defending it at all, right? What's the point of defending something that I just said is stupid, right? Well, the reason I want to defend some versions of anti-Zionism as not anti-Semitic is because anti-Semitism is really, really bad in a very specific way. And when we attach things to it that are bad for other reasons, I argue we are actually denuding the charge of the power that it absolutely must have to defend us Jews living in the diaspora. What do I mean by that? The problem with anti-Semitism, the thing that makes anti-Semitism so terrible, is the 2,000-year legacy of punching down at a defenseless people whose only defense against these bigots were joining in on the pogroms against them. We're joining in using state power to defend the anti-Semites who attacked us and killed us and murdered us and committed genocide against us, right? Is a very specific thing. That's the reason that anti-Semitism is a uniquely evil charge, because for 2,000 years, you had a defenseless people who were supposed to be protected by the state that they were supposed to be citizens of. And in many cases, they were not citizens, and they had no one to call. Imagine if there was no police, because if you called the police because you were being attacked for being a Jew, the police would take out a knife and stab you, right? Or rape your wife, okay? Like that, there's a unique evil there that Israel will never face. Baruch Hashem, Israel has the 17th most powerful army in the world. We are right now, Israeli Jews and American Jews, by the way, we are the luckiest Jews to ever walk planet Earth, very much in large part because of Tzahal. I believe that American Jews only became full citizens in 1967, when you know, the American non-Jews realized that there was a real power that was going to come to their aid if anything ever happened here. No Israeli will ever face what the Jews in the diaspora faced for much of our diaspora existence because of that powerful army. Now, that doesn't mean that they cannot be attacked by anti-Semites, right? Hamas, when they lob rockets at children, that's a political act, and it is also from bigotry. Just like you mentioned Iran, right? Iran hates Israel because it is a Jewish state. But anti-Zionism is not an act of bigotry. It is a political statement against a political entity, against a sovereign nation that, again, has the 17th most powerful army in the world. And to say that an act of opposing a sovereign nation is the equivalent or the same or the exact same or equivalent to bigotry against Jews that resulted in genocide, I just think that that is a category error, and one that denudes the charge of anti-Semitism of something that I still need it to have, because I still live in the diaspora, and the army that has to come to my defense is the United States Army. Which brings me to another point you made. You said that people who are anti-Zionist are denying Jews the right to self-determination. They're denying them the right to one form of self-determination, to have a country that is, you know, defined by their Jewishness. But I have complete self-determination in America. In fact, I spent 10 years in Israel in high school and in service in a hospital, and decided not to make my life there. I decided I felt more at home here. I felt more of an American citizen. And I don't in any way identify with the idea that I don't have full self-determination as an American. I feel deeply embedded in the fabric of American society. I feel that my contribution is here. So the charge that they believe, because there shouldn't be a Jewish state, that therefore Jews don't deserve the right to self-determination, I don't think that that is a fair charge. They don't think that they should have national self-determination, but many Israelis don't think Palestinians should have national self-determination, right? And many Palestinians who are citizens of Israel don't think that they should have national. They're perfectly happy to have Israeli national self-determination. I'll just end with this. You know, a Palestinian whose family was, let's say, fled, okay? Let's say they fled Israel in 1948, right? And now they're living in a refugee camp in Syria, right? And they sit there, right? And every day they say, my God, if there was no Israel, I would still be living on my little family, in my family village, you know, in Tantur or whatever, right? That is not an act of bigotry. I mean, they're wrong about who they're blaming for their plight, right? I'm sure we both agree that you can't be a third generation refugee. I'm sure we both agree that, you know, every party here had agency and made bad choices that resulted in this situation. But it is not an act of bigotry for them to wish that the political entity that resulted in their suffering and in the fact that their children don't have a future, to equate that with what the Nazis did, or with what Richard Spencer did, or with what, you know, Ilhan Omar says. I just feel that it is immoral to do that, because their opposition is not immoral. It comes from a place of, like, they are correct that if Israel didn't exist, they would still be living there. And so to call that bigotry, to equate that with bigotry, again, I think really waters down the charge in a way that I feel endangers me as a person who still lives in the diaspora. Okay, Mark, now prove me wrong. Let's go.
All right, Batya, good response. You see what I'm dealing with, folks? I mean, she's good, right? All right, Batya. So here's a couple things. The first is, I think when you define anti-Semitism as genocide, right, and without recognizing all the gradations of anti-Semitism, then I think you let the anti-Semites and the anti-Zionists off the hook, right? I mean, there's clearly a lot of forms of anti-Semitism that are not genocidal, right? They are deeply prejudiced, they're deeply reprehensible, they're deeply uncomfortable, but they're not genocidal. All right, so to be an anti-Semite doesn't mean you have to be genocidal. To be an anti-Zionist, who therefore is an anti-Semite, doesn't mean you're a genocidal anti-Zionist. It just means you're an anti-Zionist who has a particular conception of the right of the Jewish state to exist. So that's the first thing. All right, so let's define our terms, I think, with more precision. The second thing is you're a proud American, and you're a proud Jew, and you're a Zionist, and you recognize the importance of Israel existing and Israel having a strong military. So you mentioned the IDF. I mean, you mentioned the IDF as a cornerstone of both your identity and of the post-67 American Jewish identity. And more importantly, you mentioned the IDF is an important bulwark against those who want to destroy the Jewish state. Well, there would be no IDF without a Jewish state. So one presupposes the other. So if you are an anti-Zionist, you oppose a Jewish state. You oppose not Jewish self-determination in America or Argentina or in Canada. You oppose Jewish sovereignty. And if you oppose Jewish sovereignty, you oppose the state of Israel, and you oppose the defense forces of the state of Israel, the IDF. Okay, so you've got to make that connection. The IDF does not exist to an anti-Zionist because Israel does not exist to an anti-Zionist. All right. The third thing is, and I think all of this is tied together, and I want to get back to this, is Batya, again, a great intellectual discussion for you and I to be having in 1880 and in 1920 and in 1947. But once there is a Jewish state with 7 million Israeli Jews living there, right, the anti-Zionist wants those Jews to disappear, right? Now, how are they going to disappear? Are they going to all of a sudden give up their Teudat Zehut and say, I'm no longer an Israeli citizen? And if they do that, does that mean that they're going to be able to live in a one state with their Palestinian neighbors? And do we believe that eventuality will lead to peace and nonviolence? Do we believe that a defenseless Israel without the IDF would result in potentially in the slaughter of millions of Jews, as the Iranian regime, the Syrians, Hezbollah, Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and other enemies look to slaughter as many Jews as possible? I mean, that's what we're dealing with. So if you're an anti-Zionist and you don't want the state of Israel to exist, and you don't want the IDF to exist, then it naturally follows you're willing to put these 7 million Jews in a position where they will be defenseless and they will be potentially harmed. That makes you an anti-Zionist. It makes you an anti-Semite by any definition. Whether or not you go to the point of being genocidal, you're certainly denying the existence of the state, the military, and the right of these 7 million Israeli Jews not to come to America, Batya, and live in New York or Washington with us, but to stay in the Jewish homeland, which, I mean, I always love to quote, my old friend Charles Kreitheimer, who I think put it beautifully, and of blessed memory, that Israel is the very embodiment of Jewish continuity. It's the only nation on earth that inhabits the same land, bears the same name, speaks the same language, and worships the same God that it did 3,000 years ago, right? The Jews are the aboriginals of that area. The anti-Zionist denies everything that Charles Kreitheimer just said. And by denying that and Jewish sovereignty and the right to Jewish defense and the right to full Jewish expression in the Jewish homeland, that anti-Zionist is an anti-Semite, always. Over to you.
All right, so you a little bit strung me up with my own petard. You made a really, really good point, which is I made the point, which I totally believe, that American Jews did not have full self-determination in America until the big upset in 1967. Ergo, my self-determination here is contingent on there being a very strong military in Israel that is at the ready in case America ever, turns on Jews. So that was very well played. I'm very much going to have to think about that. I think the larger point I would make back to you is, so the anti-Zionist position, the position that, you know, many of my Palestinian friends have, is that, you know, they don't want the Jews to go anywhere. They want to live with the Jews. They just want to live, you know, as equal citizens with them. There should be one democratic state between the river and the sea, and everyone there should have equal rights. And it should be a secular democratic state, both Jewish and Palestinian, or neither Jewish nor Palestinian. So they don't want them to disappear. Now, we could say, you know, what do you think is going to happen, like in that case scenario? And like, I think you and I would agree, you know, those Jews would be less safe. Okay, that's the conclusion we have drawn based on our experiences, based on our histories, based on our personal embeddedness and our understanding and our analysis. But somebody who draws a different conclusion is not bigoted. They are simply analyzing the situation differently. Like for a Palestinian who lives in Hebron to say to me, I'm going to make sure that all the Jews here are safe. Like I could think, and I do think, that he's crazy, but he believes that. He doesn't hate Jews. And so again, to me, it's like coming back to this category error where somebody, like we cannot accuse people of bigotry for drawing different conclusions based on the situation. I think that there's, I'll give you an even more interesting, I think, example. During the last conflagration between Israel and Hamas in May, the squad took to the halls of Congress and made these very inflammatory speeches. And as a result, I believe they incited violence against Jews in many streets, you know, across the nation. Now, that said, much of what they said was not anti-Semitic. It was wrong, you know, it was inflammatory, it was incitement, but it wasn't about it didn't come, I don't think, from a source of hating Jews, and it didn't contain hatred of Jews. A little bit, it doesn't matter because it resulted in Jews being beaten up in the streets, right? So it's sort of a little bit like, well, does it matter if what they were saying was anti-Zionist or anti-Semitic? Well, no, it does matter. It does matter. And the reason, again, that it matters is because the charge of anti-Semitism is not about where somebody's, you know, someone drawing the wrong conclusions, someone analyzing the information wrong. It's about whether they harbor racism against Jews, whether they harbor bigotry against Jews, whether what they're saying suggests that they believe that Jews do not have the same rights as everybody else. And to a Palestinian who's saying, I'm offering you the same rights I'm offering myself, that we should all be equal citizens in this land that we all call home, that is not actually a double standard. That is a same standard of what they're offering themselves. So, you know, again, like I agree with you. I don't agree with them, but I think it's very important to distinguish between even saying, you know, that Israel is an apartheid, which I think is a category error, is wrong, is not true, and saying it's all about the Benjamins, which suggests that Jews are using their power and money to undermine America. Like those things are fundamentally different. And it's so crucial that we draw that distinction, even though I think they're both bad.
Yeah, but so Batya, I think, you know, you and I can debate this back and forth, but I want to get back to the definition from the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, okay? And I'm not suggesting, you may disagree with the definition, and that would be a really interesting debate. I'm suggesting a definition has been put out there. It's a definition that clearly people a lot smarter than me, probably just as smart as you, worked on meticulously, word by word, to try to get a very deep understanding of what is anti-Semitism? Is anti-Semitism just, quote, bigotry? Is it just like, you know, saying not things that are not nice about Jews? I mean, the interesting thing is, you know, we were talking about this earlier. I mean, I know anti-Semites who are Zionists. I mean, that's a phenomenon that occurs on the right. Right? Those are people in America and around the world, places like Hungary and elsewhere, who really actually hold very strongly anti-Semitic views, primarily about liberal American Jews. Right? George Soros tends to be their boogeyman, but they are passionate Zionists. They love Israel. You know, they think Israel is amazing. They recognize Israel as a partner against common threats like radical Islam. And they have a lot of respect for these tough Israelis. They admire the Sparta part of Israel and probably don't fully appreciate the Athenian part of Israel. But they are anti-Semites who hold very strong bigoted views, but are pro-Israel.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would easily argue that not all anti-Semites are anti-Zionists. But let's go back to what anti-Semitism is. Yeah. According to the IHRA definition, okay? It is accusing Jewish citizens of being more loyal to Israel or the alleged priorities of Jews worldwide than to the interest of their own nations. It's all about the Benjamins, baby. Based on that, Ilhan Omar, I'm not saying she is an anti-Semite. What she said was anti-Semitic.
Yeah.
Okay. Applying double standards by requiring that a behavior not expected to demand of any democratic nation. So no, you and I are not going to participate in a debate. I don't think anyone's going to participate in a debate that will say that denying the right for Japan to exist as a sovereign nation state is or is not being anti-Japanese, because nobody questions the right of Japan or Germany, by the way, to exist as sovereign nations. Interestingly, two nations that have engaged in genocide in World War II, no one denies the existence of the state of Germany or the state of Japan. There's no anti-Japan movement. There's no anti-Germany movement in the sense of denial. In denying the German or Japanese people their right to self-determination by claiming, for example, that the existence of Germany or Japan is a racist endeavor. But it's certainly widespread against the Jewish state. And that is a classic definition of anti-Semitism. Certainly drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis, right? A feature, not a bug, of anti-Zionism. We see that all the time in the most despicable ways. Comparing Israeli policy to the Nazis is often what anti-Zionists do. So as we go through these definitions, and by the way, holding Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel, yeah, that's why American Jews were getting beaten up on the streets of Los Angeles and New York after the last Gaza war because of incendiary comments by people like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib and others, right, who then either wittingly or probably unwittingly incited people to go beat up Jews on the streets, who held Jews collectively responsible for the actions of the state of Israel. So this is the problem, Batya. For you to accept, or let's say put it the other way, for you to reject the proposition of this debate that anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, you're going to have to reject the definition of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. Now, if that's your position, and that's perfectly legitimate for you to have that position, I think we and the audience, the audience needs to hear that from you, that you reject this definition because you don't believe that the criteria by which the IHRA has defined anti-Semitism is fair to your Palestinian friends in Ramallah or Gaza City.
Let me put it this way. I don't agree with the IHRA definition because the examples, I think some of those examples are unjust and unfair. And as an American, we're very committed to our First Amendment, and I feel very strongly about that. However, I don't oppose it publicly because I'm not one of those Jews who's like, I'm the better Jew with the better definition. I'm the good lefty Jew who's opposing that definition. Like, enough Jews put their weight behind that definition that I'm not going to make a big show or stand over not supporting it. Like, I have enough humility to say, like you said, people smarter than me worked on this, and the Jews in Europe have accepted this, and they're under much more threat than I am. And so I bring a lot of humility to that conversation and to that definition. However, when I sit down to figure out what is anti-Semitism, I do find myself disagreeing with it. So I hope that doesn't sound duplicitous. Like, I hope that doesn't sound duplicitous. That makes sense.
Yeah, it makes sense, Batya. And I just want to point out to folks, I mean, you know this, but folks on the call who may not know this is a definition that has not just been adopted by Jews. It's been adopted
yes.
by
But
millions.
I wouldn't want to see the American government adopt this definition. But
it has.
Yes, but under Trump, yes.
Oh,
And
it has, and it's been reiterated by Joe Biden's State Department.
Yes,
In
he did.
fact, recently, right? I mean, I think that the definition has been so universally embraced by so many countries and so many millions of people and leaders, including the Secretary General of the United Nations. The United Nations is not known for their Zionist leanings.
Right. Well, never wants to be to the left of the UN, but that's what I'm saying. Like, I personally don't agree with this definition. I have quibbles with it, but not enough I don't have the arrogance to stand up and say, I'm going to stand against where most Jews are at. If this is where the Jewish community is at, going to support that, but I do object to some elements of it. Yeah.
Okay, well, let's talk about the quibbles, because if you at the end of the day, if you do accept the definition, then the debate's over. Then anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism, because it's been adopted by dozens of countries, including the Biden administration. So let's talk about some of these definitions.
I wouldn't agree that that no anti-Zionist could that it's impossible for an anti-Zionist to conform to the non-anti-Semitic definition. I don't think that's necessarily the case.
I mean, I think this is the key, right? I mean, at the end of the day, I've got a very definitive proposition here, and I think it's a very difficult one, is that anti-Zionism is always anti-Semitism, right? Like, you just have to find like the one or two examples where it's not, and you win the debate.
Well, okay, what about Satmar? Like, you think they're anti-Semites? Because they're very anti-Zionist. It's like,
yeah.
So you think they're anti-Semite?
Well, sure. Wow, I mean, and let's talk about Satmar. I mean, Satmar, at least my experience with him, you've probably had more experience with him. I usually just see them outside AIPAC rallies.
No, so that's Neturei Karta. They're crazy.
Okay.
Yeah, that's Neturei Karta. But Satmar is a huge Hasidic sect. A lot of them in Israel, a lot of them in America, and they're anti-Zionist, like Beshita, like they oppose the existence of the Zionist state.
Okay, it's interesting. Okay, so good. You've got a lot more experience with them than I do. I would say that their opposition to the Jewish state is because they see it as a secular state, and Zionism as a secular ideology. They don't oppose a Jewish state. They support a Jewish state when Mashiach comes, or based on a Jewish state ruled by Torah, right? They are opposed to this Jewish state, David Ben-Gurion's socialist Jewish secular state.
Yeah, but most Palestinians would have no problem with there being a Jewish state in Uganda. They don't care, like they care that it's there, and it's the same thing with the so they care that it's there, and the Satmar care that it's now. There's no, that's not a real.
No, I think that's a key distinction. I mean, I don't think the Satmar are advocating today the elimination of the Jewish state.
Of course they are. Of course.
The elimination of the Jewish state.
Knesset, yes, the IDF, yeah, they don't support any of that.
Then they're anti-Semites based on this definition.
Oh, come on.
Well, listen, what can I tell you? I mean, again, they deny the Jewish people their right to self-determination. So I guess their argument is 7 million people should do what? Just kind of disappear, or get on boats and travel and go back to Europe and the United States?
They should do what they did before there was a state, while there were Satmar people living in Israel without a state, which is daven really hard.
Daven, and dismantle the IDF, and then in dismantling the IDF, then millions of those Jews are going to die, because you and I know without the IDF defending Jews of Israel, millions of Israelis are going to die. Millions of, by the way, Jewish and Muslim and Christian Israelis are going to die. So a position that advocates for the dismantlement of the IDF, as you so beautifully put it at the beginning of our debate, will lead to the deaths of hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Israeli Jews. That is clearly an anti-Semitic position.
Okay, so I feel like now what you're doing is, you're saying, well, if you said to me, you have to find one person who's an anti-Zionist who's not an anti-Semite. Now you're saying, well, if they're an anti-Zionist, then they must be an anti-Semite. But that's sort of, that's a tautology, right? Like these people they're like.
Oh, I said based on this definition, and by the way, your framework, which you originally laid out, right, which was highly dependent on the ability of the IDF to defend the Jewish state, Jewish sovereignty. By the way, your own Jewish self-determination and your own identity as an American Jew, that the dismantlement of the Jewish state and the dismantlement of the IDF, right, will lead to the deaths of millions of Israeli Jews. Which,
okay, if you're going to call a million Satmar Jews anti-Semites, I consider that you've just ceded the argument to me, because we should all strive to be such, Jews like these anti-Semites, right? They're
Well, listen, there, as you know, and I don't have to educate you on this, there have been many, many, many Jews through the ages who've been anti-Semites.
Yeah,
there have been many Jews who are anti-Zionists, and my argument to you is before 1948, you could be an anti-Zionist without being an anti-Semite, because there was no Jewish state. And without a Jewish state and 7 million people and an army that has to protect them from terrible enemies, this intellectual debate about Zionism and anti-Semitism is a perfectly legitimate debate. And the Satmars in 1947 could absolutely say, look, we are anti-Zionist, just as the German Reform Jews of the 1920s and 30s said they're anti-Zionist, and the communist Jews of the 1880s said they're anti-Zionist. That is an absolutely reasonable position. I disagree with it. I would have disagreed with it in 1880 as well. I would be one of those guys running around, you know, the pale settlement with my in safari shorts and my big Magen David on my shirt. I would have disagreed passionately, but I would have said, look, reasonable debate, and you're not anti-Semites. I'm sorry, the establishment of the state of Israel, 7 million Jews, they live there, an IDF to defend them. If you're calling for the dismantlement of the state and the military that protects 7 million people, you are implicitly acknowledging, or you're at least prepared to acknowledge, that those people, or hundreds of thousands, if not millions of them, could be killed. And if you are acknowledging that, I don't care how you frame it and how you dress it up, and whether you like Ali Khamenei and you talk about referenda rather than explicitly talking about nuclear weapons, if you are willing to acknowledge that position and the harm that will come to those people, you're an anti-Semite. And your friends in Ramallah or Gaza City, maybe they haven't thought through this. I'm not accusing them of being anti-Semites, because a lot of people who have these positions haven't really thought through the logical conclusion of these positions. But if they do, and they reach the logical conclusion that they are prepared to see the dismantlement of the state and the IDF to protect Jews, they are.
But I don't think that you honestly believe that 500,000 Satmar Jews in New York are supporting a position whereby their own family members would get killed, like they're literally their own children who are living in Israel. I don't think, there's no way that you believe that they actually think that their position would lead to the massacre of their own family members.
Well, because I think if you push the Satmars, and you know the Satmars, I don't, so you've more experience with them. I think if you push them today and you said, look, I get it. You're opposed to Zionism. You're opposed to the secular Ben-Gurion socialist state. You want a state built on Torah when Mashiach comes. But at the end of the day, are you prepared right now, today, to see the dismantlement of the Jewish state, of Israel and the IDF? What would they say, Batya? Would they say?
I mean, that's the position is,
well,
yeah.
That's the position. I got lots of positions, but at the end of the day, am I really willing to see them realized? No, because many of my positions, if realized, would end up with some unfortunate consequences.
Oh my God, like which ones?
Well, we can talk offline. It's very personal. But I think these Satmars would not be prepared to see, especially given their family, living in Israel, surrounded by hostile enemies, with hundreds of thousands of missiles, and Ali Khamenei building nuclear weapons to take out the Jewish state. I would be hard-pressed to believe they're willing to put their families at risk and advocate a position that would dismantle not only the Jewish state, but the IDF that protects their families. If they take that position, then they are clearly not only anti-Semites, but they obviously have no love or respect or care for the family members who would be put in harm's way.
Mm-hmm. So you think it's impossible to imagine someone arriving at a different conclusion? I think that might be the difference between us. Is I'm not willing to say that, because I like the same humility that makes me respect the IHRA definition, even though I don't agree with it, makes me respect other people's ability to arrive at conclusions different to mine, and keep open the possibility that, like, I know what bigotry looks like. I know what anti-Semitism looks like. And I know what somebody just being wrong looks like, even willfully wrong. And those are not the same thing, because when you have a member of Congress who really is bigoted against Jews, you need to have a word that refers to that, as opposed to a member of Congress who just believes woke nonsense because they think the whole world is black and white, literally, by race. And you know what I mean? There has to be.
I agree with you. I agree that there is a proposition that says stupid anti-Zionists are not anti-Semites.
Oh my God, serious? Did I just win? Legit just won.
Stupid.
Oh my God.
Stupid anti-Zionists, people who adopt a position based on no knowledge, no facts, no thought, are just idiots who come up with these positions that then they don't understand. And they advocate for the destruction of the state of Israel without thinking through that the destruction of the state of Israel could result in actually the destruction of another 7 million people, and they would be commemorating another Genocide Remembrance Day, which would be not only the Holocaust Remembrance Day, but the genocide that took place in the state of Israel when 7 million Jews got killed, I could acknowledge that that person who arrived at that position without any thought, without any consideration, and I would argue not only without any humility, but without any humanity, right, is not intentionally being an anti-Semite. They're certainly, the consequences of their position are anti-Semitic. They certainly unwittingly are an anti-Semite. And I'm also somebody who's dealt with a lot of anti-Semites, and I think you're right. You've got to have grace and humility and understanding. I mean, there have been, these athletes, these basketball players and football players. By the way, never hockey players, Canadians. You ever notice that? The hockey players never say these things. But the football players and the basketball players, they make these comments that are anti-Semitic. And they make them out of ignorance. And when somebody who's actually decided not to hammer them on Twitter and try to wreck their careers, reaches out to them and says, Joe, come to Shabbat dinner. Let's talk about Jews. Let's talk about what it means to be Jewish. Let's talk about our history. And they walk away from that experience saying, you know what? I was wrong. I was ignorant. I not only didn't have my facts, but I maybe lost touch with my sense of humanity. And I admit I'm wrong. That is a rehabilitated anti-Semite who is no longer anti-Semitic. And we should give all grace and understanding and humility to that person. I acknowledge for the anti-Zionist, the exact same thing, but that doesn't mean that that anti-Zionist is not an anti-Semite. It does mean that that anti-Zionist can be rehabilitated and no longer be an anti-Zionist. And if that's the case, that person is no longer an anti-Semite.
Well, I think that's a great place to open it up for questions because we've arrived at an agreement.
We've arrived at an agreement. Let's do that. Dave, are you going to moderate this?
Oh, wow. So many questions in the chat.
Yeah,
Wow.
Can everybody hear me? Yes?
Yes.
I can hear
Batya? Mark?
Yeah, yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
just checking. Here's the question. We established that you can be a critic of Israel and not be an anti-Semite. But let's contextualize something. I'm sure that we could come up with a particular group or number of groups whose whole raison d'etre are harsh Israel criticism all the time, hammering Israel on every conceivable slight, real or imagined, perceived or not. But if we go into the idea that a criticism of Israel, set of criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic, what do we make of these particular groups who, in context, all they are doing all day long is criticizing Israel? Mark, would you consider these particular groups or the members thereof doing anti-Semitic things or anti-Semitic?
Look, I think, Batya and I talked about this earlier. There's nothing wrong with criticizing the state of Israel and its policies, right? I mean, if there was something wrong with it, then all Israelis would be anti-Semitic because Israelis spend all their free time criticizing Israeli government policy. It's it's one of the favorite sports in Israel after basketball and soccer. But there is a difference between legitimate criticism and applying disproportionate double standards to the state of Israel that you would not apply to any other democracy, right? It's this obsession with Israel. It's this feeling like it doesn't matter what Bashar Assad is doing to Syrians or what Vladimir Putin is doing to Ukrainians or what Xi is doing to Uyghurs. We don't care. What we care about is every single thing that the Israeli government does that is, and unfortunately, it's not just we criticize them and we recommend the following 3 policy options, which would improve things, right? We don't get a lot of that. We get a lot of things that become disproportionate, not only apply double standards, but go much further. And that's when we get into things that I think greatly risk not only Israeli Jews, but American Jews. It's that incitement. It's those comparisons to the Nazis. It's calling Israel a racist endeavor. It's criticizing Israel in ways that we wouldn't criticize any other democracy, and indeed other democracies are not criticized that way. That is not only anti-Zionism, it's anti-Semitism.
Gotcha.
I definitely, when I encounter like if I encounter a Palestinian and this is their issue, that makes a lot of sense to me. When you have some random guy in Bristol and all he tweets about is Israel, I'm like, okay, you know, burden of proof's on you to show me that you're not anti-Semitic. Like, why are you obsessed? Why are you so obsessed with Israel? You know, like, what is your, it's gross. Like that to me, that does make me suspect. At the same time, the woke tsunami blasting through American institutions is no joke. And it picked up Israel as one of it's a plank in the Brahmin left's agenda, this elite liberal squad leftism that's not even real leftism. They don't care about economics or anything. And it's just a lot of people are just like they post the black square for George Floyd, like they now think that it's like, you know, they're exactly like Mark said, they're just stupid. They never thought about this before, and they're taking their cues from, you know, the same influencers who give them their woke crap. So I feel a little bit like there's a sickness in our sort of elite left-wing culture. Thank God it has not spread. Thank God the working class in America is very pro-Israel, very philo-Semitic. You know, we're not like, it's not like England where Jeremy Corbyn says Israel and like a sea of working class people is like, yeah, Jews, yeah, you know, like we don't have that. We're very, like, thank God, we're very blessed. So, but it's very circumscribed to a highly educated liberal elite. But I do think a lot of very stupid people are sort of getting swept up in a wave. And it's like hard to know what to do with that, because on the one hand, it's so stupid, but on the other hand, I don't even think Jews are the biggest victims of the woke tsunami. So we're kind of in it with a bunch of other people. Yeah, I don't know if I answered the question.
Hey, you know, Batya, it's interesting because you understandably, and I think sometimes rightly, fall back on sort of Palestinians to sort of as a carve out. Like there's a bunch of Westerners that, yeah, I acknowledge the anti-Zionist Westerners are anti-Semitic, but hey, my Palestinian friends in Ramallah and Gaza, I think they're genuine, and I don't think they're anti-Semitic. Let me ask you this question.
And let me just add, and they don't have civil rights. Like, and there is a problem. Like, they are actually living in, you know, in a situation where they are denied because of some of their own fault, some of Israel's fault. Totally agree. Blah blah blah.
Whole other debate. Yeah, agreed. But let me ask you this question. So it's 2022, and there's no Palestinian state. Is somebody who opposes Palestinian statehood today anti-Palestinian?
No, why?
Right, because there's no Palestinian state, and there's arguments on both sides about should there be a Palestinian state, should there not be a Palestinian state, and we know all those arguments from the left, from the right, and there's lots of reasons, good reasons why there should be a state. There's a lot of good reasons why there shouldn't be a state. Now, once the Palestinian state has been created, and there's a state called Palestine with its capital in presumably Ramallah, or maybe it'll have dual capitals in Gaza City. At that point, if somebody comes out and says, I oppose the existence of Palestine, I am anti-Palestinian statehood, and there are 3, 4, 5 million Palestinians living in that state, okay? At that point, is that person who now opposes something that exists anti-Palestinian?
No.
No?
No. Well, Mark, you're sitting here thinking I'm a hypocrite this whole time?
No. I'm challenging myself because it's an interesting intellectual exercise, right?
It's a political statement. It is opposition to a sovereign nation. That is political. It's not bigotry.
Okay. All right. So then, if I took the same IHRA definition, let's call it, you know, this. Let's say they put it out, but it was based on Palestinians, and they said, all right, it's you know, it's accusing Palestinians as a people or Palestine as a state of inventing or exaggerating the Nakba. Okay, it's accusing Palestinian citizens of being around the world of being more loyal to Palestine than to the United States or Canada. It's denying the Palestinian people their right to self-determination, for example, by claiming the existence of Palestine is a racist endeavor. It's applying double standards by requiring of Palestine a behavior not expected or demanded of any other democratic nation, assuming Palestine is democratic, God willing. You know, it's drawing comparisons of the policies of the Palestinian defense forces to that of the Nazis, or holding Palestinians collectively responsible for actions of the state of Palestine. All right, if it's somebody who checks off one or more of those boxes in the definition that I read you, are those people anti-Palestinian?
Well, the ones that I would say are anti-Semitic, I would say are anti-Palestinian, although I honestly this is going to be like a very right-wing thing to say, but like, you know, Palestinians, it's a very young identity. It does not have the same baggage that it is a political identity. It's not a racial identity. It's not like being Jewish. It's not an ethnicity. It doesn't have a history. It doesn't have it's different. It being Palestinian means you're from this strip of land that no longer exists as a place that you can have national self-determination. And so I probably would have a higher standard for anti-Semitism. I mean, don't tell any lefties, guys, but like, it's just different. It's not I don't think it's just like I think Islamophobia and anti-Semitism are different just based on the number of Muslims in the world and the number of Muslim countries, and like not having that thing we had where for 2,000 years you would call the police to defend you and the police would rape your wife. Like that is a very specific thing that happened to us, that when people say you're loyal to Israel and not to America, that's the thing that's getting activated in their mind. The desire that when you call the police, they will come and rape your wife. And like, that is a very unique thing that Jews have. And like, I don't really think that other things are, I mean, I do think anti-Black racism in America is comparable. It's similarly like just horrific in its ramifications, extensive, Middle Passage genocide, all of that. Like, I think that is the only thing that I would say is comparable in its magnitude. And, but yeah.
That's good, because you just made an argument. I mean, you just made an argument for why the IHR definition of anti-Semitism is compelling, is sui generis, at least in the case. I mean, you mentioned racism in America, but at least it's the only.
I think there should be a definition of anti-Semitism, and I agree with much of the IHRA. There are just a few things that I would not have put on there, but I respect. Again, I just want to say I approach my differences with humility. I'm just Batya Ungar-Sargon, and I don't think I'm better than the great minds that are behind it.
So I'd go further, because the way I read it, based on Palestine and Palestinians, right? Even though your argument is compelling, which is it's not as high a bar, or it is not as unique a circumstance, or it is not as long and dangerous a history of repression. The way I read that definition, I would say to somebody, yes, once the state of Palestine has been established, if you fit those criteria that I read, then you are, and anti-Palestinian statehood is always anti-Palestinians.
Well, I knew that you too were not a hypocrite, and so I'm not surprised to hear that.
I often can be a hypocrite, so don't give me too much credit. All right, Dave, sorry we took too long to answer that one.
Here we go. The host unmuted you. We got a question about the Texas synagogue terrorist and how authorities misidentified, perhaps, the motive. They initially said it wasn't an anti-Semitic attack. Initially, and then they backpedaled, and they did say it was an anti-Semitic attack. I think the question is, would like your read on this. Is this just a matter of ignorance? Is this a matter of we wanted some more information? Is there a third option? I leave this up to the two of you. Presumably you saw this in action when the authorities, I believe it was the FBI, made such a statement. And curious to know what your thoughts were and are.
I'll go first. Also, I just want to, hi, Gil. I do think Corbin is anti-Semitic, so I just wanted to answer that because it's an easy one, a quick one. What the FBI actually said was the attack was not specifically concerned with the Jewish people, and what they were trying to say was that there's no larger plot here at stake. This is not some big plot coming and attacking Jews. Now, of course, it was a very infelicitous thing to say. As I tweeted, this guy traveled thousands and thousands of miles to go to a synagogue and made the rabbi of that synagogue call another rabbi at another synagogue because that second synagogue was called Central Synagogue, and then told that rabbi to call the president and release this, Lady Al-Qaeda, right? There's literally one word in the English language to describe the thought process that resulted in that, and it is anti-Semitism. It was good that they backtracked, but I do think this was a situation of like policing language. I do think he was sort of, look, these guys they're not like us. They don't spend all day like learning how to formulate things like articulately. I don't think he was trying to say it wasn't anti-Semitic. I mean, I kind of like dunked on it on Twitter, but I do think he was trying to say there's no larger plot here at stake. This was like a lone wolf. But this was not even anti-Zionist. It was just classic anti-Semitism. He was completely convinced that the Jews could get him out of prison because we have all this power and we're all connected and we know all the people in power and we know all of each other, right? So it was sort of almost like farcical, if it wasn't so terrifying and horrible. That was my read on it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with all of that. I think the only thing I would add is, and having spent a lot of time with law enforcement, working on a range of issues. First of all, I think absolutely innocent mistake, well-intentioned, but it does get to something that I think is important. And that is that we have been much too tolerant of the anti-Zionist carve-out, okay? The anti-Zionist carve-out is looking for the exceptions where we can say, all of that is anti-Semitic, but that, no, not anti-Semitic, that's just anti-Zionist. And I think because this debate has illustrated really how difficult it is to find that carve out, or what Batya called the quibble. The problem is when you operationalize this throughout the political, media, academic, law enforcement communities in America, with people who are not spending much time trying to dissect this and understand this and distinguish this and find the carve out, that anti-Zionism becomes anti-Semitism. And anti-Semitism often, not always, as I pointed out, is also anti-Zionism, right? That's why Jeremy Corbyn, who, by the way, you admitted he's an anti-Semite. I mean, Jeremy Corbyn, for the most part, the most offensive things that Jeremy Corbyn said were not actually explicitly about Jews qua Jews. They were about Israel. I mean, he fit the classic definition that I've outlined numerous times here in the way in which he talks about Israel. And so this is the danger of the anti-Zionism carve out, that in the hands of people who don't have the finesse and the intelligence and the nuance of Batya, very easily those anti-Zionists become anti-Semite.
No, I would agree with you. Like, I think a lot of anti-Zionists use the word Zionist instead of Jew to spread. They'll just say an anti-Semitic thing, and instead of saying it about Jews, they'll say it about Zionists. Like 95% of us are Zionists. So it's like, essentially, they've just learned. That's what Corbyn did. He said, Zionists don't have a sense of irony. Like, that's just like a disgusting British thing to say about Jews, right? No sense of humor, whatever. But so is it your position that Palestinians have to be Zionists to avoid being tarred as bigots? Do you really believe that? Because I think that's an untenable position to ask people who Israel came at their expense to support its existence in order to not be called bigots. Like, I think that is really like not a moral position.
No, listen, I think the reality is you can live in this world and be indifferent to Zionism and not be an anti-Semite. You can live in this world and you can, like the Palestinians who are living under an occupation, want to find a better life and have an independent state, have two states for two people, have Jerusalem divided so Jerusalem can be its capital, and live with dignity and prosperity and peace, and not be an anti-Zionist. However, if you deny the existence of the state of Israel on whatever piece of territory, no matter how big or small, or does it include these settlements or that settlements or Jerusalem or this one, but if you deny the existence of the state of Israel, if Palestinians are saying Israel should not exist on any land, in any form, yes, your Palestinian friends are anti-Semites. If they say that 100% Israel should exist, in fact, Israel should be, we like Israel, Israel is a democracy, they should be over there, we should be over here, two sides, two people, a divided capital. Of course not. They're not. First of all, that's not an anti-Zionist position, and it's clearly not an anti-Semitic position. So I think those are the distinctions between the Palestinian positions that are held. One is a Hamas position. It's genocidal. It denies the Jews the right to live on any piece of that territory. And one is call it a Fatah position, where at least they've acknowledged, we might question their sincerity, but at least they've acknowledged that there is a two-state solution with a divided Jerusalem. And that position is not anti-Semitic.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I got a note from Agnes just to thank you both graciously for your time and your insights. Batya and Mark, we're very appreciative. We're very appreciative of,
It's such a pleasure for me. I don't think I've ever sold fewer books in my life. In fact, I think anyone who bought my book is probably wrapping it back up to send it back to Amazon. But I think it was really important, and I'm so honored to have. And Mark, I just adore you. I think you're so smart, and this was really a privilege for me, and really an honor.
Batya, the honor was absolutely mine. You are not only a delight, one of the smartest people out there, and you really are. You're an intellectual warrior. You're taking on. You're actually interesting because you're one of the few people I've seen who can take on the media while appearing in the media. It's really interesting. Like I came to Washington 20 years ago, and you know, one of my colleagues said to me, "Look, we got to be careful about not criticizing the media because we want to be in the media." And he said, "We'll never be in the media if we criticize it." And Batya performed this Herculean task of hammering the media in the most incisive and I would argue intellectually brutally honest way you can. And yet she's all over the media and far more than I am. So God bless you, Batya, and keep at it.
Thank you, Batya, and thank you, Mark. Thank you, Dave, and thank you everyone for joining us this evening.
Thanks, guys.
Lots to think about.
appreciate it. Thank you very much,
Good night, everyone.
Bye.